They gave him a grave, a name on stone. Everything except the truth. Philadelphia, 1957. A city of brotherly love, they call it. A city of industry and ambition, of row homes and church bells, of families who work hard and children who play in streets still safe enough to know your neighbors' names. But in February of that year, something arrived in Philadelphia that would challenge everything the city believed about itself. Something small, something broken, something that would haunt the conscience of an entire generation. On February 25th, a young man named Frank was checking his muskrat traps in the woods of Fox Chase, a neighborhood on the northeastern edge of the city. It was cold that day, the kind of cold that makes the air sharp in your lungs, that turns breath to vapor and makes you walk faster just to keep warm. Frank was experienced, methodical. He knew these woods. He'd walked them 100 times, maybe 1,000. But on this particular afternoon, as the weak winter sun filtered through bare branches, he saw something that didn't belong. A cardboard box, a J.C. Penney bassinet box to be precise, the kind young mothers might bring home with a crib or changing table inside. It sat off the path, partially hidden by underbrush, about 10 feet from a quiet road called Susquehanna. The box was weathered, but not destroyed. Recent, Frank thought. Maybe a few days old, maybe a week. He approached it slowly, curiosity mixing with something else. Something that made his hands hesitate before lifting the lid. Inside was a child, a boy, small, maybe 4 years old, maybe 6. It was hard to tell. He was wrapped in a cheap blanket, the kind you might find at any 5 and dime store. His body had been placed carefully, almost tenderly, inside the box. He was naked. His hair had been cut recently, crudely, with uneven chunks missing, as though someone had tried to change his appearance in a hurry. His fingernails and toenails had been trimmed. His body had been cleaned, scrubbed even, though not well enough to hide everything. Frank stood there in the cold woods, looking down at this child, and something inside him broke. He would never be the same. None of them would be. The police arrived within the hour. Detectives from the Philadelphia Homicide Division, uniformed officers, a medical examiner. They cordoned off the area, began their methodical documentation. Photos were taken, measurements recorded. The box was examined for fingerprints, for any trace evidence that might lead them to whoever had done this. The boy's body was transported to the medical examiner's office, where Dr. Joseph Spellman began what would become one of the most scrutinized autopsies in the city's history. What he found painted a picture of suffering that still, decades later, is difficult to confront. The boy had been malnourished, severely. His body showed signs of chronic neglect, of meals missed not once or twice but regularly, systematically. His arms and legs bore scars, old injuries that had healed poorly or not at all. There were marks on his ankles and wrists, evidence that he had been restrained, possibly for extended periods. His growth was stunted. His muscle development was poor. This was a child who had not been cared for, who had not been loved, who had existed on the margins of whatever household he came from, like a secret too shameful to acknowledge. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. Someone had struck this boy hard enough to kill him, and then they had cleaned him, cut his hair, trimmed his nails, wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in a box in the woods, like something to be discarded, like trash, like a problem that needed to disappear. But who was he? That was the question that would consume Philadelphia for years, then decades, then generations. Who was this child? Where did he come from? Who had hurt him? And perhaps most haunting of all, why did no one report him missing? The investigation began immediately and with tremendous resources. This was 1957, remember. America was in the midst of post-war prosperity, of suburban expansion and nuclear families, and the kind of optimism that made tragedies like this feel particularly obscene. Children were precious. Children were protected. The idea that a child could be murdered, discarded, and never claimed by anyone was almost incomprehensible. Detective Sam Weinstein took the lead. He was a veteran of the Homicide Division, a man who had seen plenty but nothing quite like this. He began with the most obvious question. Had any children been reported missing in Philadelphia or the surrounding areas? The answer, impossibly, was no. Not a single missing child report matched the boy's description. Not in Philadelphia, not in the suburbs, not in New Jersey or Delaware or anywhere within a 100-mile radius. Weinstein expanded the search. He contacted police departments across Pennsylvania, then across the Northeast, then across the entire country. He sent out bulletins with the boy's description, his approximate age, his physical characteristics. He waited for anyone, to step forward and say, "That's my son. That's my nephew. That's my neighbor's child." No one did. The police released photographs to the newspapers. This was a calculated risk, and a controversial one. The boy's body had been cleaned and prepared by a local funeral director, his hair combed, his face arranged in a peaceful expression. The photo showed a child who could have been sleeping. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran it on the front page. So did the Bulletin. Within days, the image had spread across the country. It appeared in newspapers in New York, Boston, Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles. Millions of people saw that face. No one recognized him. If stories like this unsettle you, if they make you question what we miss when we look away, then subscribe. Because the files I open here don't close easily, and the next one may be darker still. Tips began flooding in almost immediately. Hundreds in the first week, then thousands. The police followed every single one. They chased leads in Baltimore, where a woman claimed the boy looked like her neighbor's child who had suddenly disappeared. They investigated reports in rural Pennsylvania, where a teacher said one of her students had stopped coming to school around the same time. They traveled to New Jersey, to New York, to Massachusetts. Every lead went nowhere. Every identification was wrong. One tip seemed particularly promising. A man came forward claiming he had information about the boy. He said he had been traveling through Foxchase around the time the body was likely placed there, and he had seen a car parked near Susquehanna Road. He described it in detail: a dark sedan, American-made, possibly a Chevrolet or Ford. There had been a man standing near the car, he said, looking nervous, agitated. The man had watched him drive by, then quickly gotten into the vehicle and driven away. The police worked with the witness to create a composite sketch. They showed it around the neighborhood. They checked motor vehicle registrations. They interviewed every man in Foxchase who owned a dark sedan. Nothing came of it. The witness's story, though detailed, couldn't be corroborated. Eventually, detectives began to wonder if he had seen what he claimed to see, or if his memory had been influenced by the knowledge of what had been found in those woods. Another theory emerged, one that would persist for decades. Detectives noticed that not far from where the boy was found, there was a foster home. It was run by a man named Arthur, a single man in his 50s, who had been taking in children from the city's welfare system for years. The home was small, crowded, and by some accounts poorly managed. Neighbors reported that they had seen many children come and go, that the conditions seemed questionable, that Arthur himself was odd, reclusive, possibly abusive. Detective Weinstein visited Arthur multiple times. He asked about the children in his care, about any who had left recently, about any who had died. Arthur was defensive, evasive. He claimed all his children were accounted for. He said he kept meticulous records and that the city's welfare department inspected his home regularly. When pressed, he became angry, accusatory. He suggested the police were harassing him because he was trying to help children no one else wanted. The police obtained a warrant to search the home. They found conditions that were indeed questionable: too many children in too small a space, inadequate food, poor hygiene. But they found no evidence linking Arthur to the boy in the box. His records, though disorganized, did seem to account for all the children in his care. None of them matched the boy's description. None of them were missing. Still, suspicion lingered. Years later, decades later, people who grew up in Foxchase would talk about that foster home, about Arthur, about the strange atmosphere that surrounded him. Some claimed they had seen a boy matching the description living there before the body was found. Others said they had heard screams coming from the house at night, but none of these claims could be verified. None of them led anywhere concrete. The investigation expanded in other directions. Detectives considered the possibility that the boy had been brought from another state, perhaps even another country. They contacted immigration authorities, looking for records of children who had entered the country recently and then disappeared. They examined the blanket the boy had been wrapped in, the box he had been placed in, looking for manufacturing details that might narrow down where they had been purchased. The blanket was cheap, mass-produced, available at dozens of stores across the city. The box was similarly common. Both were dead ends. Medical experts were brought in to examine the boy's remains more closely. A dentist looked at his teeth, hoping to find evidence of dental work that might be traced to a specific practitioner. The boy's teeth showed signs of severe decay and neglect, but no dental work at all. He had never been to a dentist. An anthropologist studied his bone structure, looking for clues about his ethnic background, his geographic origin. The results were inconclusive. He appeared to be white, possibly of European descent, but beyond that, nothing could be determined with certainty. The police tried everything. They consulted psychics, though Weinstein himself was skeptical. They distributed flyers in every neighborhood in Philadelphia. They set up a tip line that ran 24 hours a day. They offered a reward for information. Nothing worked. The boy remained nameless, unclaimed, a ghost in a city of millions. And then there was the question of burial. By the end of 1957, it had become clear that the investigation was stalling. The boy's body had been in the medical examiner's office for months, preserved as evidence, but there was nowhere else for it to go. Eventually, the city made a decision. The boy would be buried, with dignity, in a plot donated by a local cemetery. A small funeral was held. No family attended because there was no family. Instead, there were detectives, social workers, clergy, and a handful of citizens who felt compelled to witness this child's final rites. A gravestone was commissioned. It read, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." Beneath that, the date, February 25th, 1957. The grave was placed in Ivy Hill Cemetery, in a section visible from the road, so that people would see it, so that they wouldn't forget. And they didn't forget. That's the remarkable thing. In a world where tragedies are consumed and discarded daily, where yesterday's horror becomes today's footnote, this case refused to fade. The boy in the box became part of Philadelphia's collective memory, a wound that wouldn't heal, a question that wouldn't be answered. The years passed. The investigation officially remained open, but active work slowed, then stopped. Detective Weinstein retired, though he never stopped thinking about the case. He kept a file at home, a thick folder of notes and photos and dead-end leads that he would sometimes take out late at night when sleep wouldn't come, and review again, looking for something he had missed. In the 1990s, the case experienced a resurgence. A woman came forward with a story that seemed, at first, almost too convenient to be true. Her name was Martha, and she claimed that she knew who the boy was. She said he had been her brother, that she had grown up in an abusive household in Philadelphia, that her mother had purchased the boy from an unwanted pregnancy, intending to raise him as her own. But the boy had been difficult, Martha said. He had been ill, possibly mentally disabled. He had been a burden. And one day, after he had vomited up his meal, her mother had beaten him to death in the basement of their home. Martha's story was detailed, specific. She described the house, the basement, the moment of the boy's death. She said her mother had forced her to help clean the body, to cut his hair, to place him in the box. She said they had driven to Fox Chase and left him in the woods, and then they had never spoken of him again. The police investigated Martha's claims extensively. They located the house she described. They excavated the basement, looking for evidence. They interviewed family members, neighbors, anyone who might corroborate her story. They found nothing. No physical evidence, no witnesses, no documentation of a child who matched the boy's description ever being in that household. Moreover, there were problems with Martha's story, details that didn't align with the known facts of the case, timelines that didn't match, medical findings that contradicted her account. Eventually, investigators began to suspect that Martha was either mistaken, confused, or had fabricated the story for reasons they couldn't quite understand. Perhaps she had conflated different memories, different tragedies, into a single narrative. Perhaps she was seeking attention or closure for her own abusive childhood. Perhaps she genuinely believed what she was saying, even if it wasn't true. The lead went cold again. If you're still listening, If this case has gripped you the way it gripped an entire city, consider subscribing. The stories here don't offer easy answers. They offer something more valuable, the truth, or as close as we can get to it. In 1998, the boy's body was exhumed. Advances in forensic science, particularly in DNA analysis, offered new hope. Perhaps genetic material could be extracted, a profile created, a familial match found. The exhumation was done carefully, respectfully. The small casket was opened, the remains examined. DNA was indeed extracted, though the quality was poor due to the decades of burial and the embalming process that had taken place before the original interment. Still, a profile was created. It was entered into databases, compared against samples from missing persons cases, from unidentified remains, from relatives who had submitted their DNA in hopes of finding lost family members. There were no matches. The boy's genetic code, like his name, remained isolated, unconnected to anyone in the system. The boy was reburied, this time in a new casket, in a new plot in the same cemetery. A larger headstone was erected, this one reading, "America's Unknown Child." It became a pilgrimage site of sorts. People began visiting, leaving flowers, toys, notes. Some came out of curiosity, others out of grief, still others out of a sense of responsibility, a need to ensure that this child, whoever he had been, was not forgotten. Over the years, various theories have been proposed. Some investigators have suggested the boy was the victim of a child trafficking ring, that he had been brought to Philadelphia specifically for abuse and then discarded when he became too much trouble. Others have theorized that he was the child of an undocumented immigrant, someone too afraid to come forward, too afraid of deportation to claim their own son. Still others believe he came from a deeply dysfunctional family, one so isolated from society that his disappearance simply wasn't noticed by anyone outside their household. There's a particular cruelty in that last possibility, isn't there? The idea that a child could exist so far on the margins of society that no one, not a teacher, not a neighbor, not a relative, no one at all would notice when he was gone. It suggests a level of neglect, of systemic failure that's difficult to confront. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what we miss, about who we overlook, about the children who slip through every crack in every system designed to protect them. In 2016, the Philadelphia Police Department released the boy's DNA profile to the public, hoping that advances in genetic genealogy might finally provide answers. This was a new frontier in forensic science, one that had already solved several cold cases by comparing crime scene DNA to genetic material voluntarily submitted to ancestry databases. The technique had identified killers, identified victims, reunited families. Perhaps it could finally give the boy in the box a name. As of today, it hasn't. The boy's genetic profile has been compared to millions of others. Distant relatives have been identified, branches of family trees that might, if traced back far enough, lead to his identity. But the work is painstaking, complicated by incomplete records, by families that have dispersed or died out, by the simple fact that so much time has passed. The investigators working the case today, descendants of Detective Weinstein's obsession, remain hopeful. But they are also realistic. They know that they may never know his name. There's a photograph that haunts me, and maybe it will haunt you too. It's the one they released in 1957, the one that appeared in newspapers across the country. The boy is lying in his casket, his face peaceful, his hair neatly combed. He looks like any child, like someone's son, like someone's brother. He looks like he could wake up at any moment, could open his eyes and ask where he is, could tell us his name and where he came from and what happened to him. But he can't. He's been silent for nearly 70 years now, and unless something extraordinary happens, unless some piece of evidence emerges that has eluded generations of investigators, he will remain silent forever. I think about the person who placed him in those woods. I think about them often, actually. What were they feeling as they carried that box through the cold February woods? Was it guilt, relief, fear of being caught? Or was it nothing at all, just the mechanical completion of a task, the disposal of a problem? I think about whether they're still alive. They would be old now if they are, in their 80s or 90s perhaps. Do they think about what they did? Do they wake up at night and see his face? Do they tell themselves they had no choice, that circumstances forced their hand, that it was mercy or necessity or something other than what it was? Or do they feel nothing at all? There's a theory, unpopular among investigators but worth considering, that the person who killed the boy and the person who placed him in the woods may not be the same. That perhaps someone discovered the boy's body, panicked and disposed of it to avoid suspicion or involvement. That the true killer may have never known that the body was found, may have assumed it was hidden somewhere else, somewhere it would never be discovered. It's a theory that multiplies the tragedy. It suggests that the boy was failed not once but twice. First by whoever killed him, and second by whoever could have reported his death, but chose instead to hide it. The Fox Chase neighborhood has changed considerably since 1957. The woods where the boy was found have been partially developed. Houses have been built, roads widened, the landscape transformed by decades of growth and change. But the memory remains. Ask anyone who grew up in that area, anyone who lived there in the 50s or 60s or 70s, and they'll know the story. They'll remember the boy in the box. Some of them will tell you they think about him every time they drive past that spot, every time they walk through what's left of those woods. There's power in that, I think, in the collective refusal to forget, in a city's decision to keep asking questions even when the answers seem forever out of reach. It would be easy to move on, to file the case away as one of those unsolvable mysteries, one of those tragedies that time and entropy have placed beyond our ability to resolve. But Philadelphia hasn't done that. The case remains open. The investigation, such as it is, continues, and every few years, when new technology emerges or a new tip comes in, detectives return to the file, return to the evidence, and try again. Why? What drives that persistence? I think it's because the boy in the box represents something larger than a single unsolved case. He represents every vulnerable child, every person who exists at the margins, every victim whose suffering goes unnoticed until it's too late. To give up on finding his identity, to stop asking who he was and what happened to him, would be to accept that some lives don't matter, that some deaths don't deserve justice, that some questions aren't worth answering. And that's a line Philadelphia has refused to cross. In 2019, a team of forensic artists used the boy's skull to create a new facial reconstruction, utilizing technology that hadn't existed in 1957. The result was striking. A young face, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with soft features and large eyes. It was distributed online, shared across social media, viewed by millions. Tips came in again, just as they had in 1957, just as they had in 1998. And just as before, none of them led anywhere conclusive. But something else happened too. People began leaving comments, hundreds of them, then thousands. They weren't offering tips or theories. They were offering something else: remembrance. They wrote messages to the boy, as though he could somehow read them. They told him they hadn't forgotten him. They promised he would never be alone. They called him by various names: the boy in the box, America's unknown child, the Fox Chase boy. Some simply called him Sweetheart or Little One. It was a strange, spontaneous outpouring of collective grief for a child no one had known, for a person who had no name. And yet in a way it was precisely because he had no name that so many people felt connected to him. He could be anyone's child, anyone's brother, anyone's friend. His anonymity made him universal. If this story has moved you, if you find yourself thinking about that small grave in Ivy Hill Cemetery, then maybe you understand why I do this, why I open these files, why I tell these stories, why I believe they matter. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the work of remembering isn't finished, and neither am I. There are still people working the case today, detectives, genealogists, volunteers who have taken it upon themselves to solve a mystery that has defeated every official effort for nearly 7 decades. They work with the DNA profile, tracing family trees back through generations, looking for connections that might eventually lead to the boy's identity. They review old records, census data, birth certificates, looking for a child who matches his description and who disappeared around the right time. They monitor missing persons databases, hoping that someday, somehow, a match will appear. And they visit his grave. They bring flowers, they clean the headstone, they sit in the grass and talk to him as though he can hear. Maybe he can. Maybe somewhere in whatever comes after this life, he knows that he hasn't been forgotten, that people are still searching, still asking, still refusing to let his story end in silence. I want to tell you what I think happened, though I should be clear that what follows is speculation, a theory constructed from years of reading case files and thinking about the patterns that emerge in cases like this. I have no special knowledge, no inside information. This is simply where the evidence and logic lead me. I think the boy came from a deeply troubled household, one that existed in isolation from the broader community. I think he was either the unwanted child of a large family or the child of a single parent or guardian who lacked the resources or will to care for him. I think he was abused systematically over a long period, and that his death, when it came, was the result of that ongoing abuse rather than a single incident of rage or violence. I think whoever killed him panicked. They realized that a dead child in their home was impossible to explain, impossible to hide indefinitely, and so they made a decision. They would dispose of the body in a way that prevented it from being traced back to them. They cleaned him, cut his hair to change his appearance, trimmed his nails, removed anything that might identify him. They wrapped him in a common blanket, placed him in a common box, and left him in woods that were remote enough to delay discovery, but not so remote that he would never be found. And then they went on with their lives. They told no one. They reported no missing child. They allowed the city to search, to investigate, to plead for information, and they said nothing. I think that person is dead now. I think they died years ago, maybe decades ago, taking the boy's identity with them. I think the few people who might have known something, who might have seen something, are dead as well. And I think that's why, despite every technological advance and every investigative effort, the case remains unsolved. But I could be wrong. Maybe the killer is still alive. Maybe someone out there knows exactly who the boy was and what happened to him, and they've simply never spoken. Maybe they've been carrying that secret for 70 years, and maybe, just maybe, they'll reach a point where they can't carry it anymore. That's the thing about secrets like this. They have weight, they have gravity, and over time they become harder and harder to bear. The boy in the box teaches us something important, something uncomfortable. He teaches us that our systems of protection, our social safety nets, our communal bonds of care and attention are not as strong as we like to believe. He teaches us that children can fall through the cracks, can be abused and neglected and killed, and no one, not a single person, will notice or care enough to intervene. He teaches us that monsters don't always look like monsters. They look like neighbors, like family members, like ordinary people living ordinary lives. And by the time we realize what they've done, it's often too late. But he also teaches us something else, something redemptive. He teaches us that empathy is powerful, that the collective decision to remember and to care, even for someone we never knew, even for someone whose name we'll never learn, is meaningful. That grave in Ivy Hill Cemetery, covered in flowers and toys and notes, is a testament to humanity's capacity for compassion. Every person who visits that grave, who leaves something behind, who spends a moment thinking about a child they never met, is engaging in an act of remembrance that matters. Because if we forget him, if we decide that his story isn't worth telling anymore, then we're saying that his life didn't matter. And that's a lie. Every life matters. Every child deserves to be remembered, to be mourned, to be loved, even if that love comes decades too late. I don't know if this case will ever be solved. The rational part of me doubts it. Too much time has passed. Too many potential witnesses are dead. Too much evidence has been lost to the years. But another part of me, the part that opens these files late at night and can't let them go, that part still hopes. That part believes that somewhere, in some forgotten archive or fading memory, the answer exists. And maybe, if we keep asking, if we keep searching, we'll find it. Until then, there's a small grave in Philadelphia. A gravestone that reads America's Unknown Child. A place where strangers come to mourn a boy they never knew. And in that ongoing act of remembrance, in that refusal to forget, maybe there's a kind of justice. Not the justice of a solved case or a convicted killer, but the justice of a child who, in death, finally received the care and attention he was denied in life. He left no name, no family, no mark on the world except for the mystery of his absence. But he left something else too, a question that an entire city chose to carry. Who was he? What happened to him? And why did no one come forward to claim him? Those questions remain. They echo through decades, through generations, through the careful work of detectives and genealogists and ordinary citizens who refuse to let this story end in silence. And perhaps that's the most important thing I can tell you tonight. That these stories, these cases, these lives, they don't end when the investigation stalls, or when the file gets closed, or when the years accumulate and memories fade. They end when we stop asking questions. They end when we stop caring. So I ask you, don't stop. Don't forget the boy in the box. Don't forget the thousands like him who died without names and without justice. Don't forget that behind every cold case is a human being who mattered, who was loved or should have been loved, who deserves to be remembered. If you've listened this far, if this story has stayed with you, then do something with that feeling. Subscribe to this channel, yes, but more than that, pay attention. Notice the vulnerable people around you. Notice the children who seem neglected or afraid. Notice the systems that fail, the cracks that people fall through. And when you see something wrong, say something. Do something, because the greatest tragedy of the boy in the box isn't that he died. It's that he died alone, unclaimed, unmissed by anyone. It's that he lived in such isolation that when he disappeared from the world didn't even notice. We can't bring him back. We can't give him the childhood he deserved, the love he needed, the life he should have had. But we can ensure that his death meant something. We can ensure that his story, however incomplete, serves as a reminder and a warning and a call to action. In Fox Chase, there's a stretch of woods that looks like any other. Trees and undergrowth, paths worn by decades of footsteps, sunlight filtering through branches in patterns that change with the seasons. If you didn't know what happened there, you'd walk right past without a second thought. But if you do know, if you've heard the story, then you see something else. You see the place where a child was abandoned, where a mystery began, where a city's conscience was tested and, in its own imperfect way, rose to the challenge. I've been there. I've stood in those woods, on that spot, and tried to imagine what Frank felt when he opened that box. The shock, the horror, the profound sadness of seeing a child reduced to refuse, discarded like something worthless. And I felt angry. Angry at whoever did this, angry at the systems that allowed it to happen, angry at a world that can be so casually cruel to the most vulnerable among us. But I've also felt something else. Determination. The determination to keep telling this story, to keep asking these questions, to keep believing that truth matters and justice matters, and that every life, no matter how brief or how troubled, deserves to be acknowledged. That's why I do this. That's why I open these files. Why I spend my nights researching cases that most people have forgotten. Why I believe that the work of remembering is sacred work, important work, necessary work. Because silence is complicity. Forgetting is erasure. And every time we choose to remember, every time we choose to care about someone we never knew, we're making a statement about what kind of world we want to live in. A world where every child matters. A world where no death goes unnoticed. A world where justice, however delayed, is always worth pursuing. The boy in the box has been waiting for nearly 70 years. Waiting for someone to say his name. Waiting for someone to tell his full story. Waiting for someone to answer the questions that have haunted a city since 1957. He's still waiting. And so am I. So are the detectives who still work his case. So are the genealogists who trace his DNA through generations. So are the thousands of people who visit his grave, who leave flowers, who whisper promises that they won't forget. We're all waiting together, connected by a story we wish had ended differently, united by the belief that some questions are worth asking, even when the answers seem impossible to find. Maybe tomorrow someone will come forward. Maybe a DNA match will finally appear. Maybe some forgotten document will surface in some dusty archive, and suddenly, after all these years, we'll know his name. We'll know where he came from. We'll know what happened to him and who was responsible. Or maybe we won't. Maybe the mystery will remain forever. Another unsolved case. Another file that never gets closed. But even if that happens, even if his name stays unknown and his killer unidentified, something important will have been accomplished. A child who was neglected in life will have been honored in death. A life that was dismissed as worthless will have been declared valuable. A story that could have been forgotten will have been preserved, told and retold, passed down through generations. That matters. That means something. The boy in the box came into this world unloved and left it unmourned. But in the years since his death, he's been adopted by an entire city, claimed by thousands of people who never knew him but couldn't forget him. He's been given flowers and toys and prayers. He's been given a place to rest and a stone to mark his grave. He's been given the one thing that was denied him in life: attention, care, the acknowledgement that his existence mattered. It's not enough. It's not justice, not really. But it's not nothing either. And maybe that's all we can do sometimes. When justice is impossible and truth is elusive and the past is sealed away beyond our reach, maybe all we can do is remember. Maybe that's enough. A small boy lies in Ivy Hill Cemetery under a stone that doesn't bear his name. He's been there since 1957 waiting, and we're still here, still asking, still refusing to let him be forgotten. If that means something to you, if you believe that these stories matter, that these lives matter, that the work of remembering is worth doing, then stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, share these stories, keep asking questions. Because somewhere, in some file yet unopened, in some case yet unsolved, there's another person waiting to be remembered, another story waiting to be told, another mystery that refuses to stay buried. And I'll be here in the quiet hours when the world sleeps, opening those files, asking those questions, telling those stories. Because some secrets are too important to keep, some voices are too important to silence, and some children, no matter how many years have passed, are too important to forget. The boy in the box, America's unknown child. He had a name once, someone knew it, someone spoke it, someone somewhere loved him or should have loved him. We just don't know who. But we're still looking, still asking, still hoping that someday, somehow, the silence will break and the mystery will end and a child who died alone will finally be known. Until then, there's a grave in Philadelphia. There are flowers on the stone, and there are people, strangers mostly, who stop by to remember a boy they never knew. That's the power of these stories. They connect us across time and distance, across the boundaries of life and death, across the divisions that usually keep us separate. They remind us that we're all human, all vulnerable, all capable of both tremendous cruelty and unexpected compassion. And they remind us that the work of caring, the work of remembering, the work of seeking truth and justice, that work is never finished. It passes from one generation to the next, an inheritance we didn't ask for but can't refuse. So here's what I ask of you, here at the end of this file, at the end of this story that has no ending. Don't forget. Don't let this boy's life disappear into the past unmarked and unacknowledged. Tell someone about this case. Visit his grave if you're ever in Philadelphia. Submit your DNA to a genealogy database because maybe, just maybe, you're the distant relative whose genetic material will finally solve this mystery, or simply carry his story with you. Let it change how you see the world, how you notice the vulnerable people around you, how you respond when something seems wrong, because that's how we honor the dead, not just by solving their cases or punishing their killers, but by learning from their suffering, by becoming the kind of people who would never allow such tragedies to happen on our watch. The boy in the box died in darkness and silence, abandoned in woods that held no witness but the trees. But his story has been told in light, in voices that refuse to be silenced, in the persistent human need to know and to care, and to ensure that no life, however brief, is lived and lost without meaning. That's the legacy of this case. Not the mystery itself, but the response to it. The way an entire city decided that this child mattered, even without a name. The way detectives spent careers chasing leads that went nowhere. The way ordinary people, people with no connection to the case at all, felt compelled to visit a grave and leave flowers for a stranger. It's messy, this kind of justice. It's incomplete. It doesn't give us the satisfaction of a solved case, of handcuffs and courtrooms and punishment delivered to those who deserve it. But it gives us something else, something harder to quantify but no less important. The collective refusal to accept that some lives are disposable, that some deaths don't matter, that some questions aren't worth asking. I think about the future sometimes. I think about what will happen to this case in another 70 years, in a world where everyone who was alive in 1957 is gone, where the boy in the box is not a recent tragedy, but a historical one, as distant to people then as cases from the 1880s seem to us now. Will anyone still care? Will anyone still visit that grave? Will anyone still ask who he was? I believe they will, because this case has transcended its specifics. It's become a symbol, a touchstone, a reminder of something fundamental about human nature and human society. It's become the case that represents all the other cases, all the other children who died unmourned, all the other mysteries that were never solved. And as long as children are vulnerable, as long as systems fail, as long as people care about justice and truth, this case will matter. This story will be told. This boy will be remembered. There's a question I haven't asked yet, one that might be the most important of all. What would he want us to do? If the boy in the box could speak to us now, if he could tell us what he needed, what would he say? Would he want us to find his killer? To punish whoever hurt him? Would he want us to uncover his identity, to give him back the name that was taken from him? Or would he want something else, something simpler and more profound? I think he would want us to protect the children who are alive now, the ones who are being abused, neglected, beaten, starved, hidden away in homes where no one asks questions and no one intervenes, the ones who are falling through the same cracks that swallowed him, the ones who will, if we don't act, become the cold cases of tomorrow. That's the real work, isn't it? Not just solving the mysteries of the past, but preventing the tragedies of the future. Not just remembering the dead, but protecting the living. And that work is hard. It's complicated. It requires us to be more observant, more willing to get involved, more comfortable with being uncomfortable. It requires us to see things we'd rather not see, to ask questions we'd rather not ask, to confront systems and individuals and patterns that would be easier to ignore. But if we're willing to do that, if we're willing to be the kind of people who notice and care and act, then maybe the boy in the box won't have died for nothing. Maybe his death, horrible as it was, can serve as a catalyst, a wake-up call, a reminder that vigilance and compassion aren't optional luxuries, but essential necessities. I want to read you something. It's from one of the notes left at the boy's grave, written by someone who visited in 2018, more than 60 years after his death. The note was found by a volunteer who tends the grave, and she photographed it before the weather took it away. It says, "I don't know your name, but I know you mattered. I don't know who hurt you, but I know they were wrong. I don't know if there's anything after this life, but if there is, I hope you're there and you're safe and you're loved the way you should have been loved here. I'm sorry we failed you. I'm sorry no one protected you. I'm sorry you died alone. But you're not alone anymore. We're here. We remember. We care. And we won't forget." That note, written by a stranger to a child who died before they were born, captures something essential about this case and about the human capacity for empathy. We are capable of caring about people we never met. We are capable of grieving for strangers. We are capable of feeling responsibility for injustices we didn't commit, but that happened on our watch, in our world, in our species. That's not weakness. That's not sentimentality. That's strength. That's the thing that makes us human. The thing that separates us from the person who could place a child's body in a box and walk away. The sun is setting on Philadelphia as I tell you this story. Somewhere in that city, in Ivy Hill Cemetery, there's a small grave with flowers on it. Someone put them there today, or yesterday, or last week. Someone who didn't know the boy, but couldn't forget him. Someone who wanted him to know wherever he is that he matters. And in police headquarters, there's a file. It's thick, accumulated over decades, filled with dead ends and false leads and theories that went nowhere. But it's still open, still active, still waiting for the piece of information that might, after all these years, crack it open. And in laboratories, geneticists are working on his DNA profile, tracing it through populations and generations, following threads that might lead to a name. And in homes across the country, across the world, people who have heard this story are thinking about it, talking about it, sharing it with others who might have information or might know someone who has information. The work continues. The search goes on. The boy waits. How many people have searched for him now? How many detective hours? How many laboratory hours? How many volunteer hours have been spent trying to answer the question of who he was? Thousands? Tens of thousands? If you added it all up, if you calculated the collective effort that has gone into this single case, the numbers would be staggering. And some would say that's wasteful. Some would say that resources could be better spent on solvable cases, on living victims, on problems that have solutions. Some would say that at a certain point you have to accept that some mysteries will remain mysteries, that some questions will never be answered, that some cases should be closed. But I disagree. I think every hour spent on this case, every effort made to identify this boy, is an hour well spent and an effort worthwhile. Because it's not really about solving one case. It's about sending a message. It's about saying that every victim matters, that no death is too old or too cold to pursue, that we don't give up on people just because they're difficult to identify or because decades have passed. It's about values. It's about what kind of society we want to be. Do we want to be the kind of society that gives up, that accepts injustice as inevitable, that allows children to die unnamed and unclaimed? Or do we want to be the kind of society that fights, that persists, that refuses to accept that some lives don't matter enough to pursue justice for? I know which one I want to be, and I think, if you've listened this far, you know which one you want to be too. There are people alive right now who know what happened. I believe that. Someone somewhere knows who the boy was. Maybe they were there when he died. Maybe they heard about it afterward. Maybe they suspected something but never had proof. Maybe they were children themselves when it happened, and they've carried a terrible secret into adulthood. And maybe they're listening right now. Maybe they've heard this story, and they're thinking about what they know, about whether it's finally time to speak. If you are that person, if you have information about this case, I'm asking you, come forward. It's been nearly 70 years. Whoever hurt this boy is likely dead. The legal consequences, if any, would be minimal. But the moral weight, the burden of knowledge, the decades of carrying a secret that could give a child his name back, that burden must be enormous. You can lift it. You can end this mystery. You can give Philadelphia and the world, and most importantly this boy, the closure that has been sought for so long. Call the Philadelphia Police Department. Leave an anonymous tip. Write a letter. Use whatever method feels safe to you. But please, if you know something, say something. Because every day that passes is another day that this child remains nameless. Another day that whoever hurt him escapes acknowledgement of what they did. Another day that a city's wound stays open. You have the power to change that. You have the power to finish this story. But even if that person never comes forward, even if this case remains forever unsolved, I want you to understand something crucial. This story still matters. The boy in the box still matters. The effort to find his identity still matters. Because the value of a life is not determined by our ability to solve the mystery of its end. The boy's life had value the moment he was born, the moment he took his first breath, the moment he became a conscious being capable of feeling and thinking and existing in the world. Nothing that happened afterward, nothing that was done to him or failed to be done for him, can change that fundamental truth. He mattered. He matters still. And every person who has worked on this case, who has visited his grave, who has heard his story and felt moved by it, is participating in an act of acknowledgement that has profound moral significance. They are saying, you existed, you were real, you were human, you deserved better, and we will not forget you. That's not nothing. That's everything. I want to end with a thought that's been with me throughout the telling of this story, a thought that I hope stays with you long after you've finished listening. Somewhere, in some forgotten corner of some forgotten archive, there might be a record. A birth certificate, maybe, or a hospital record, or a school enrollment form. Something with a name on it, a name that matches the boy in the box. Something that has been sitting there for decades waiting to be found, waiting for someone to make the connection. Or maybe the answer isn't in an archive at all. Maybe it's in someone's memory, someone who's still alive, someone who was a child in 1957 and who remembers another child who lived nearby, who was there one day and gone the next, who was never spoken of again. Or maybe the answer is in DNA, waiting for the right relative to submit their genetic information to the right database, waiting for technology to advance just a little further, waiting for a genealogist to trace one more branch of one more family tree. The answer exists. It has to, because the boy existed. He was born somewhere, to someone. He lived, however briefly and tragically. He had a name. He was real. And if the answer exists, then it can be found. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, maybe not in my lifetime. But eventually, if enough people care, if enough people keep searching, if enough people refuse to give up, the answer will emerge. I believe that. I have to believe that. Because the alternative, the idea that some truths are forever lost, that some children will remain forever nameless, that some questions can never be answered no matter how hard we try, that alternative is too dark to accept. So I choose to believe in persistence. I choose to believe in the power of collective effort, of technological advancement, of the human refusal to accept defeat. I choose to believe that one day, maybe decades from now, someone will find something. And when they do, when that final piece of the puzzle clicks into place and the boy in the box finally gets his name back, it will be because of all the people who refused to forget him, who kept searching, who kept asking, who kept believing that every life deserves to be known. If you're still with me, if this story has reached you in the way I hoped it would, then I ask you one final thing. Don't let it end here. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Visit the boy's grave if you can. Submit your DNA to a genealogy database. Pay attention to the children in your community who seem neglected or afraid. And remember, just remember that in 1957, a child died alone and unmourned, and that for nearly 70 years, an entire city has refused to let him be forgotten. Remember that empathy is powerful, that persistence matters, that every life has value even when the world tries to tell us otherwise. Remember the boy in the box. Remember that he was real, that he mattered, that he deserved better. Remember that his story isn't over. Not yet. Not while people still care, still search, still refuse to accept that some mysteries can't be solved. This is Julian Cross, and this has been the Midnight File. The case remains open. The search continues. And somewhere in a cemetery in Philadelphia, a small boy rests under a stone that doesn't bear his name, waiting for someone to speak it, waiting for someone to bring him home. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep searching for truth, and never, ever forget that behind every cold case is a human being who deserved better than they got. The file is still open, and so for now is this story. Good night.